Now, before we move on, I think it's also pretty important to operationalize some of these definitions. So when I'm referring to behavior change, we're talking about a behavior change that ends up being permanent, that over time becomes automated. It's about altering behaviors that have a level of permanence to them. All right. Now, once you learn to really effectively tie your shoes, you've done it so many times, you could do it blindfolded, you could do it in a car, you could do it with one hand, because it's something you've done for a very long period of time. And sure, you might say, well, yes, that's a simplified example. But at the end of the day, all of the things that we're going to discuss are reasonably simple skills. They're really simple things to do. The difficulty comes in applying them at the appropriate times. And again, we're going to learn all of this stuff. We're going to discuss everything in depth, and so you can apply everything to your own individual context and get the best results out of it. I also think it's important to create an awareness around some of the obstacles that people face. A lot of the times people might go into a situation without fully understanding the difficulties, the setbacks, the constraints, and so on. And if we don't effectively understand the problem, there's no way we're going to be able to come up with an effective solution. So we have to know the problem first. We have to know the constraints and the obstacles and everything it is that we're going to be facing potentially, or at least try and minimize the number of uncertainties. The more that we can minimize the number of uncertainties beforehand, the better equipped we are to actually address those things as they come up, as opposed to if we just launch into something and we don't know anything about it and we're unprepared, the probability that we're going to have the appropriate solution at the appropriate time and execute it with 100% effectiveness is going to be next to nothing. Okay, so let's discuss why behavior change is so difficult. Well, the first reason is because repeated behavior becomes encoded over time and then turns into habituated behavior. Okay, so habituation is obviously something turned into a habit. So at this point, it's become deeply ingrained in your sort of behavioral format. Now, the longer a particular behavior has been encoded for, the harder it's going to be to change. So an example of this is, let's say we have a child who's 5 years old and he's overweight. Now, by the time he's 25 years old, let's say he's still overweight. That's 20 years of encoded behavior. So he just graduated university, he's getting a job, and he's entering the workforce, but he's got 20 years of encoded behavior. That is going to be much, much more difficult to change than someone who, let's say, gained 5 pounds over a summer. Okay? And one of the reasons for that is because, again, the behavior has been encoded for a long period of time. Now, if a child has parents that are overweight or obese, the probability that they will end up overweight or obese is 10 to 12-fold greater. So 10 to 12 times higher probability of them becoming overweight or obese as they enter adulthood. Now, if they're already overweight as a child, we are going to have a long history of negatively encoded behavior, of behavioral modeling, so modeling the eating behaviors and the emotional states of their parents and things like that. And 20 years is a very, very long time. So we're talking about potentially very serious health consequences because, again, obesity is classified as a disease now. Whether that's appropriate or inappropriate, we're not necessarily going to get into that, but obesity is a chronic condition. So what that means is that the duration that you were in that state of, or that obesogenic state, increases the risk factors. So if you gain 50 pounds in 3 months and then you lose it in the next 3 months, that's going to be super bad for your health. But it's nowhere near as bad as being 50 pounds overweight for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, right? The excess adiposity has several different risk factors that extended over time become infinitely more significant and detrimental to your health. Because again, it is a chronic condition. It's not just, eating one piece of food that makes you overweight. It's the consistent excess consumption of calories that makes you overweight. Now, changing behavior. This is something that I hear every now and then. There's an expression I say, it takes 21 days or it takes 28 days to break a habit. I can't remember which one it is, but it's something along those lines. That is just not true. It's inaccurate to say that it takes a predetermined period of time to create a new habit or break an existing habit, because it's going to be so contextual that you can't necessarily make a determination. Because even if we have two individuals with almost the exact same context, because they are still unique in their thought process, they might still have completely different journeys because they are individual. So again, the time it takes to break a habit or encode new behavior can change, and it's contextual. One of the other reasons why behavior is so difficult to modify is because, as I mentioned previously, we don't necessarily have a comprehensive understanding of all of the variables that actually influence our behavior and the decisions that we make on a regular basis. So this is where it's important to discuss something called the biopsychosocial model. So the biopsychosocial model essentially talks about the intersectionality of our physiology, our psychology, and our social and environmental factors. Now, I want to give some examples to kind of contextualize some of these things. So when we're talking about biology, we can talk about hunger signaling. Now, hunger signaling can become dysregulated for all sorts of reasons, okay? If we have an individual who is significantly like overweight or obese, oftentimes it's associated with diurnal effects on hunger signaling and even things like leptin resistance, right? So when those two things can kind of become dysregulated, that can affect your hunger signaling or your feeling of satiety in spite of having enough calories, okay? So that's an example of a physiological element that can absolutely affect your eating behavior. If you're eating a bunch of food and you're not becoming full, you're probably going to overeat. That is what's going to happen in many cases. Now, you can exercise restraint and you can have a whole host of other skills that are going to help you with that, but that doesn't mean that physiological quality or experience disappears. It just means that you have the skill sets to cope with it. So lots of people, when they experience negative affect or like negative emotional states, and that's kind of a broad umbrella, they have a tendency to overeat. Other people have a tendency to undereat. So each individual, when they experience the same emotion, can have differentiating or divergent behavioral characteristics that manifest. So for myself, for instance, when I get really, really stressed out, or if I'm really not in a good mood, I lose my appetite. I just really don't want to eat. I have no desire to eat. I feel full all the time. I'm just like, oh, I just don't feel good. Other people, they tend to binge eat. And in fact, previously, when I was younger, when I felt bad or depressed or anxious or something like that, I actually had the opposite effect where I would binge eat all the time. So, even within the same individual, you can have different manifestations of behaviors that are a response to a specific or even the same emotional state. As an individual evolves, as their skill set evolves, and all sorts of things, that can happen. Now we have social and environmental factors. If you're constantly going out with your friends who are drinking, the probability that you are going to drink again and relapse goes up exponentially. So environmental factors can absolutely play a role. Even stressors, if you're really stressed out because of work, that's an environmental trigger that could cause an increase in stress and anxiety. And again, stress and anxiety can lead to physical manifestations of unproductive or even harmful behaviors, right? So an environmental trigger cause an internalized emotional state, which then can eventually lead to some sort of behavior that's undesirable. So all of these things are related, okay? And there is an intersectionality between them. So it's not the case that we can just sort of trichotomize or try and separate all of these things out. Every single one of these elements are interrelated. And if you affect one, in many cases, you're going to affect the others. And so when people say, the environmental factors are what drive obesity, or genetics drive obesity, or this drives obesity, that's false. Obesity is driven by many factors. It's multifactorial. So delayed discounting is also something that's important. So this is the depreciation of the value of a reward or punishment relative to the time that it takes to be released. So what this essentially is discussing is immediate rewards versus long-term consequences, or long-term rewards, but you have to pay a price up front. Okay. And so a lot of the times people aren't willing to do that. So that's delayed discounting. So oftentimes people can't delay gratification in order to get what they want. They, are emotionally stressed and they're like, oh, I just need to alleviate this anxiety. So they go and they decide to eat. Okay. They're eating to regulate their emotional state because you get an increase in dopamine afterwards, kind of helps decrease that sympathetic, like fight, flight, sort of panic mode that you're at. So that dopaminergic surge presents that reward. So it's an immediate reward with a long-term consequence, but because the consequence is far away, we don't necessarily value it to the degree that we probably should. Because again, no one eats like a Big Mac and gets fat like that. If we did, no one would eat Big Macs because the consequences would be immediate. But because we only get a positive result initially, and when I say positive, I don't mean objectively positive, I mean the reward that we happen to receive. Even a negative behavior can have a functional purpose, okay? And we'll get into all of that stuff a little bit down the road, but the functional reward that they get in the meantime or in the short term outweighs the potential risks or costs that they might experience long term. Next, we can look at social identity and connection and relatedness. Now, we're gonna expand a lot on this when we start talking about self-determination theory and internal versus external locus of control, but that's kind of in a later section of this module. But right now, it is important that we kind of introduce this topic, at least just very superficially. So, previously I had mentioned about an individual social environment, how it might be difficult to get away from alcoholism if they have a bunch of friends who consistently drink all the time. Now, those friends might not have any substance abuse problems. They might not have any issues with alcohol abuse, but this particular individual does. And that's how they interact. They interact through drinking. So it becomes a very unproductive social element for them. And if that's how they relate to other people, well, changing that pattern of drinking and initially removing them from that environment because it ends up being a trigger or a catalyst for that unproductive behavior also means that they're removing part of their social support group. So oftentimes, like I said before, these things don't exist in isolation. We're removing the potential negative stimulus, but in some cases, we can also be removing a very significant benefit. So how do you navigate those situations? Hey guys, I can only hang out with you if you never drink or if you don't drink while I'm there, right? Now we can have these conversations and there's a lot of things that need to happen in order to get there. But again, these things do exist. How you relate to other people, your social environment, your sense of identity. If you're someone who consistently eats dinner with their family and that's how you connect. But a huge aspect of connection is food, right? Is around food. And that's like a global phenomenon. People will come and have dinner together and that's how they connect. And so if you're struggling with overeating, but everyone that you're connecting with is also overeating, or they're eating a bunch of foods, or it's putting you into an environment where the propensity or the probability that you're going to overeat is higher, that's a real difficult situation because, again, you remove yourself from that potential trigger. You also remove your social support, your sense of self-identity, your sense of relatedness, your connection to other people, your social support. So these things are not necessarily isolated. They don't exist in a vacuum. So each decision that you make can have other potential costs or trade-offs. And so as we get into the behavior modulation process and the step-by-step approach or the principled approach, it's important to understand the trade-offs of each decision and how you can scale the intervention depending on your specific context. So we're going to give you all of the details and talk to you about how to apply it to your specific context later on. But again, this is a lot of information you need to understand beforehand so that your application of these tactics can be infinitely increased in terms of their efficacy and success. When we look at emotionality and eating behavior, okay, so emotional volatility is often associated with behavioral restraint issues. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you're someone who really has a lot of emotional outbursts, if you have crazy highs and lows, if you're depressed and anxious and you're constantly going through these wild mood changes and you have a really hard time regulating your emotional states, almost always, or in many cases, that's going to be associated or have some sort of physical manifestation in terms of volatile behavior or lack of restraint. Okay, so you're going to really struggle with restraining particular behaviors. So there's lots of different problems that we can look at that, again, are related. And if we don't understand where these problems are coming from, it's really hard to make sense of our behavior or how to change it. Now, there's a 1992 paper, and this has been validated many, many times again. And so this is something that's seen fairly consistently in the literature. It's not just this paper. But this particular paper, 1992 by Arno et al., found that anger, anxiety, and sadness accounted for roughly 95% of the moods preceding a binge eating episode. Okay, so if you're someone who struggles with binge eating, oftentimes that's preceded by some sort of negative emotional state, whether that's due to some sort of external trigger or whether that's just due to, how you kind of are normally or whatever it might be. That is a really important thing to understand because then we stop trying to say, okay, when I feel this way, I'm going to stop eating. Instead, we kind of take a step back and say, okay, why don't I kind of try and prevent that negative emotional state from happening in the first place? Now, in order to do that, I need to understand why, a particular instance or interaction or trigger caused this. And then you need to take a step back again. So we really have to kind of go down the rabbit hole and go to that sort of find that singular thing. And oftentimes they're not a singular thing, it's multiple things. But when we can find those things, that if we just kind of cut things off there, it prevents us from going, into all those negative places. So here's an example of what I mean by that. That's a little bit more practical and easier to understand. Let's say a married couple. Okay, there's a married couple. I know married couples who will not, under any circumstances, hang out with a person of the opposite sex alone. Now, is it because they don't trust their partner? No. It's specifically because they say, I'm not going to do it because I'm not going to put myself in the position where that could ever even be possible. And whether you agree with that or not, that's their determination. That's fine. But what they are doing is they're putting in a safeguard. They're saying, I'm not even going to allow myself to get into a position where the possibility of infidelity could ever manifest, because I will only ever hang out with a woman or a man or whatever if my partner is there, or if I'm with a group of friends, or whatever sort of constraints they're setting on their marriage. And doing things like that, again, I'm not talking about marriage, so if you disagree with that or have any problems with that, that's fine. But the example is creating a constraint that prevents the possibility of you being in an environment where you may or may not create unproductive habits or allow unproductive behaviors to occur. Okay, so this is kind of thinking ahead. But again, you have to really go down the rabbit hole to kind of identify the appropriate time to put that constraint in. Now, for restraint ability and low self-awareness often compound in a negative way. So again, if you don't know that negative emotional states often, in your case, let's say hypothetically, lead to binge eating episodes or, restraint issues or loss of control or any of that stuff, then it's going to be really hard to actually create a better system for yourself, right? But if you are aware of the potential triggers and the obstacles and limitations, and if you know which skills you need to employ and when you need to employ them and how you need to employ them, oh man, your probability of success just went up infinitely. And then the more skills we can give you and the more exposure that we can give you to those negative experiences, over time, you just get more practice. It's like throwing a jab. First time you throw a jab, it's probably not going to look very good. But after you throw 50,000 jabs, man, that thing's going to look pretty solid, okay? Then we can talk about shame, self-judgment, and just negative affect. Okay, so we already talked about how negative emotional states can lead to unproductive behavior at times, again, because of their association. But self-judgment and shame are also really big. And these are very negative and can often have very negative consequences in individuals' lives, especially when it pertains to adherence. So let's say you do have negative emotional state that does lead to a binge eating episode. What follows that? Often we're like, fuck, I'm such a piece of shit. I have no self-control. No matter what I do, I can never do anything right. Of course, I'm so weak. I have no willpower. And it's just this, like, you're just beating yourself down over and over and over. And it's just not helpful, right? It destroys your self-confidence. It destroys your self-efficacy. It destroys any sense of agency that you might have over your life. It's horrendous. Self-judgment, self-criticism, shame, guilt, all that stuff. There are reasons why we have these emotions. So I'm not going to say that those emotions are bad, because they actually do have a very, very important purpose, right? And that's a slightly different, almost philosophical or theistic discussion. But as it pertains to this, generally speaking, those are not helpful. Now it is, and this is kind of it might sound a little bit contradictory to what I just said. It's important to understand why those emotions exist, but oftentimes they're not helpful. But it is still important to understand why they exist, okay? One last thing that I want to say to kind of end things off is emotional intensity is not the same as a plan. Now, what I mean by that is there are many times where I'll encounter an individual and they'll come to me for coaching or something like that. More so in the past, not as much anymore, generally, because people tend to filter themselves out before they come to me. So I generally tend to attract individuals who are more serious about their goals, more disciplined, more dedicated, not necessarily, the kind of people to like start and stop. So they kind of filter themselves out. But definitely earlier on in my career, I would get a lot of people who would come to me and they'd be like, oh, I want to lose weight. And like this time I'm serious. I'm like 100% in, like nothing's going to stop me. And I'd say, okay, why is right now different? Like, why do you feel that way? And like, well, this is just different. Like I'm so set on this. And it's like, you have no plan. There's no plan. You're just experiencing a very high level of intense emotions. That's not a plan. That would be the equivalent of me going into a bank and saying, hey guys, I want a loan for $1 million. I want to start a business. And they're like, what's your plan? They're like, I don't have any plan, but I feel really confident that I'm going to make more money. So just give me the loan and then I'll pay it back to you. I'm like, absolutely not. That's ridiculous. But people do this stuff all the time when it comes to pursuing certain goals. They mistake emotional intensity for certainty, and they assume that there's going to be a level of permanence there. But emotional states are not permanent. They are transient. Emotions are always transient. There's always an ever fluctuating and sort of undulation of emotional states. And that's what it means to be human. And so we cannot rely on the stability of a particular emotional state in a lot of cases, because these emotions are fleeting. Now, we can do a lot to create stability from an emotional and psychological state, absolutely, but we can't assume that the intensity that we generate is always going to be there. And so you have to understand that you cannot necessarily rely on an intense emotional state to determine whether or not you're going to be successful long term, because it, by definition, is transient. So I hope that makes sense.